On September 5th, 2025, a custom-built underwater robot named Deep Emerald slipped below the surface of Lake Tahoe and kept going. It did not stop at the depth where a scuba diver would black out. It did not stop at the point where the light completely disappears. It kept ascending, past every barrier, past every depth that had kept this lake a mystery for more than a century, all the way down to 574 feet. And its cameras were broadcasting live to anyone in the world who wanted to watch. Thousands of people watched. They had grown up hearing the stories. They had read the legends. They had been told for decades that whatever waited at the bottom of this lake was either impossible to reach, or too dark to see, or in the version that absolutely refuses to die. Too horrifying for anyone to describe. And now, for the very first time in the history of human exploration of this place, they were going to find out. What those cameras actually recorded did not match a single version of what the legends had promised. What it showed instead was stranger, more unsettling in its own way, and infinitely more important than any ghost story could ever be. Let us start with what Lake Tahoe actually is, because the scale of this place is something that words alone have difficulty fully delivering. The lake sits high in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, on the border of California and Nevada, cradled inside a basin that was carved out by fault lines and shaped over thousands of years by ancient glaciers grinding through solid rock. From the shore, on a clear morning, it looks almost calm. An enormous blue surface ringed by pine trees and granite peaks, ski slopes visible above the beaches, the kind of scene that ends up on postcards. But that surface is completely misleading about the true size and nature of what lies underneath it. Lake Tahoe is the second deepest lake in the entire United States. Its deepest measured point sits 1,745 feet below the surface. That number is difficult to visualize without a comparison. The Empire State Building from its base to the tip of its antenna stands roughly 1,454 feet tall. Lower that entire building into the deepest part of Lake Tahoe, and the very top of it would still be nearly 200 feet underwater. You would not see it from a boat on a calm day. It would simply be gone. The Eiffel Tower, with its 1,000 feet of iron structure, would not even reach 2/3 of the way down. There is that much water here, approximately 39 trillion gallons of it, enough to give every single person in the United States more than 75 gallons of water per day for 5 full years without running out. This is not a lake in the way that most people think of lakes. It is closer to a cold, freshwater sea, one that holds its own weather systems, its own internal currents, and its own crushing pressure in the deep dark below. And it is the dark below that matters here, because that is the place where the legends live. As an underwater vehicle descends through the water of Lake Tahoe, the first thing that happens is not darkness. In fact, the opposite happens. Near the surface, the clarity of this lake is almost impossible to believe. Scientists from UC Davis have been measuring Lake Tahoe's clarity annually since 1968, and what they record is the depth at which a white disk lowered on a rope disappears from view. In recent years, that number has averaged around 62 to 69 feet. That sounds modest until you stand at the edge of the lake and actually look down. Individual pebbles are visible far below your feet. The bottom appears close, even when it is not. The light seems to last forever. When the Deep Emerald ROV began its descent on that September morning in 2025, the people watching the live stream could see the ROV's own aluminum frame reflected in the water below it, the cables trailing like thin threads, golden columns of sunlight driving straight down through the water like solid beams. Someone watching the live stream described it as looking at glass, not water. But clarity is not depth, and the two things behave very differently as you go further down. The ROV kept descending, its fiber optic tether paying out steadily behind it, and the monitors tracking its journey began to change in a way that was slow enough to watch, with a kind of beauty but unsettling enough that nobody in the viewing audience could look away. The bright surface blue began to thicken and darken. The golden columns of sunlight grew thinner, then fainter, then disappeared entirely. Colors left the picture one by one the way they always do underwater. The reds vanishing first, then the oranges, then the warm tones, until everything on the monitor was rendered only in deep blues and slowly deepening black. The depth counter kept climbing. 100 feet, 200, 300. By this point, the ROV's own LED lights were doing all of the work. The camera was pushing its white cone of illumination into water that had gone the color of deep midnight. And here is where the physics that built the legends becomes completely real. Below approximately 600 feet, the temperature of Lake Tahoe stops changing with the seasons. Right at that boundary, the water settles into a near constant temperature that hovers just above 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature at which fresh water reaches its maximum density, becomes its heaviest, sinks to the bottom, and stays there. It does not warm in summer. It does not freeze in winter. It simply holds, perpetually in motionless cold that has not meaningfully changed since long before any person alive today was born. The water at the very bottom of Lake Tahoe is essentially a refrigerator that has never been turned off. Dr. Sudeep Chandra, Foundation Professor of Limnology at the University of Nevada, Reno, joined the September 2025 live stream to explain the science as Deep Emerald descended. And he described Lake Tahoe as a meromictic lake, meaning a lake that rarely or perhaps never fully mixes from the very surface all the way down to the deepest floor. The top layers mix every year with seasonal changes. The deepest water may not have mixed with the surface in an extremely long time. In warm, oxygen-rich water, things decay quickly. Wood rots, metal corrodes. Organic material breaks down within days or weeks depending on conditions. But in cold, near-freezing water with low oxygen, and almost no biological activity of the kind that drives decomposition, that entire process slows to almost nothing. This is the physical reality that the legends grabbed and ran with, and they were not entirely wrong about the physics. The coal down there does genuinely slow decay in ways that produce results that would seem impossible to someone who had only ever seen things decompose in normal conditions. Scientists have documented wood at the bottom of the lake that remains remarkably preserved after thousands of years. The refrigerator effect is real. What the legends added on top of that real physics was the cargo. They filled the real cold dark with standing corpses in suits, with mob victims from the casino era, with a diver surfacing pale and shaking with a warning he could never fully speak. The physics was real. The cargo was invented. The most famous piece of that invented cargo has a name attached to it that made the story impossible to dismiss for generations. The legend states that at some point in the 1970s, the legendary French ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau brought a submersible to Lake Tahoe, descended into its deepest darkness alone, reached the bottom and surfaced a changed man. Quiet, pale, shaken in a way that people who knew him had never seen before. And when pressed for what he had found down there, he reportedly gave the single line that has been repeated in campfire circles and internet forums ever since. The world, he is said to have replied, is not ready for what is down there. It is a perfect sentence. Read it and feel immediately how it works. It says nothing concrete. It describes not one single object, but it implies everything. It transforms an ordinary cold alpine lake into a sealed vault of forbidden knowledge, protected by the reluctance of a hero. If Cousteau of all people was too shaken to describe what he saw, then whatever was down there had to be beyond ordinary horror. That sentence became the keystone on which the entire mythology of Lake Tahoe's dark reputation was balanced. Everything else hung off it. The standing corpses, the intact suits, the perfectly preserved faces in the dark, the graveyard that no diver could reach and no machine had ever mapped. And here is the turn that reorients everything. That sentence has no verifiable source. None. Search for a recording of Cousteau saying it. Search for a transcript, an interview, a printed page with a date. A single journalist who was present when he said it. Nothing solid exists. The quote travels from person to person in every telling, growing more dramatic with each repetition, and yet nobody can point to the moment it left his lips. There is no confirmed record that Cousteau ever conducted a submersible dive in the deepest section of Lake Tahoe at all. Members of his own family have spent decades quietly pushing back against the story. The most famous evidence for the horror at the bottom of Lake Tahoe is a sentence that may never have been spoken by the man it is credited to. It is a ghost with no body. And when you pull that keystone out, you have to look at everything else that was hanging from it with completely different eyes. Not because the lake is not deep, it is. Not because the cold does not preserve things, it does. But because the leap from those real physical facts to a standing army of perfectly preserved dead was never made by evidence. It was made by a very good storyteller, and the story spread because the physical facts made it feel plausible enough to believe. Once you understand that, you understand why the September 2025 dive mattered as much as it did. For most of the lake's history, proving any of this was impossible. The depth made it that way. Recreational scuba diving becomes dangerous well before 130 feet, where nitrogen begins to affect the brain in ways that are both insidious and deadly. Push a human body further, and the pressure becomes a different kind of threat, compressing gases in the blood into forms that will kill you on the way back up if you do not surface with perfect precision and patience. The cold strips heat from an unprotected body with efficiency that is almost impossible to appreciate until you experience it directly. And layered on top of all of that, Lake Tahoe sits more than 6,000 feet above sea level. The air is thinner at altitude, and the physics of pressurized gas that every dive table is built around shifts in ways that narrow the already thin margin for human survival even further. Depth, cold, and altitude combined. It is a place that was almost perfectly designed to keep human beings out, and to keep its floor safely in the realm of imagination and legend. Machines have no body to lose. They do not need oxygen. They do not need warmth. They do not have a nitrogen limit or a decompression schedule. They go where human beings cannot, and they send everything they see back up the cable to a screen where warm, dry people can watch. The Deep Emerald ROV was specifically built for exactly this purpose, funded by the Tahoe Fund and the Martis Camp Foundation, equipped with a 600-meter fiber optic tether that allowed for both the depth capability and the live video quality needed for a real-time broadcast. Carrying LED lights and a 4K Ultra HD camera, it was a machine purpose-built for the moment that Cousteau supposedly attempted alone in a cramped submersible in the 1970s. Lindsay Kopf, the founder and executive director of Restoring the Lake Depths Foundation, piloted Deep Emerald during the September 2025 livestream and described the controls as extremely sensitive, comparing operating it to playing a video game at a level of precision that took real time to learn. As Deep Emerald continued its descent past 500 feet, past 600, deeper into the permanent cold and permanent dark, something began to appear on the monitors that stopped the audience watching the live stream with a reaction that was equal parts wonder and genuine unease. Not bodies, not the thing the legends had built. Trees, standing at the bottom of the lake at depths no diver could safely reach, still rooted, still vertical, their trunks rising from the lake bed in the posture of a living forest, some holding skeletal branches that reached upward into the black water above them. A tree rolling in the shallows is something the mind files away easily enough, but a tree standing upright, rooted exactly where it grew, occupying the same spot where it once reached toward sunlight, is a landscape that has been submerged completely intact, not knocked over, not dragged into a pile, just standing exactly as it stood when the water came up and swallowed it. Research on submerged trees in the Lake Tahoe basin has produced radiocarbon dates ranging from roughly 2,000 to more than 5,000 years old. Scientists studying similar submerged forests in nearby Fallen Leaf Lake, just 1 mile south of Tahoe, used side-scan sonar, ROV imagery, submersible dives, tree ring analysis, and water balance modeling to determine that a massive medieval megadrought lasting more than 200 years had caused the lake level to drop dramatically, allowing forests to grow in areas that normally sit underwater. When the drought eventually ended, the water rose back up and preserved those trees in the near-freezing conditions that the legends had reserved for human bodies. The cold and stillness that the storytellers wrapped around standing corpses had, in reality, been doing something far more verifiable and far more ancient. It had been holding entire drowned forests in suspended time, trees that were already old when Rome was still standing, preserved in the dark by the same physics that made the ghost stories seem possible in the first place. To produce trees that are standing in their original positions, the lake level must have been low enough for those areas to be dry ground. Dry enough and long enough for full forests to grow to mature size, which takes not years, but centuries. Then the water rose again and covered them, slowly enough that the trees were not knocked over, slowly enough that they remained exactly where their roots held them. And then the cold sealed them in place and kept them there across thousands of years, while empires rose and fell on the surface of the earth above. The survey could show you that this happened. The dates confirmed it. The exact mechanism, the precise sequence of drought and refill, is still being studied and still carries genuine mystery. This is real science with real unknowns, and those unknowns are more interesting and more honest than the invented unknowns the legends offered. And then what the camera found deeper still, in the areas where the legendary graveyard was supposed to wait, produced the moment that the entire history of this lake's mythology had been building toward without knowing it. The ROV reached depths past 600 feet and moved its lights across the bottom, and what the camera resolved out of the dark was not a field of preserved corpses. It was not 9 figures standing in a ring with their eyes open and their suits still pressed. Lindsay Kopf and the team of experts watching had, in previous expeditions using the same ROV, already documented what the deep floor of this lake actually holds. In those earlier dives, they had pulled approximately 80 tires from the lake floor. They had found litter scattered across the sediment, glass and cans and debris from the boats and the beaches and the decades of summer crowds. They had found a perfectly preserved happy birthday balloon resting on the very bottom of the lake at the very deepest point, its silver foil still intact and readable, a piece of one person's celebration sitting in permanent darkness nearly 1,600 feet below the surface. The cold and stillness that the legends promised would hold bodies in perfect preservation had instead been faithfully preserving every piece of garbage that ever sank to the bottom of one of the most celebrated and supposedly pristine lakes in North America. The lake's own famous clarity, which had dropped significantly from its measured peak of 102.4 feet in 1968 down to just 62.3 feet by 2024, according to the most recent UC Davis reports, is being reduced by the same runoff and pollution that has been delivering debris to the floor for generations. The very thing that makes Lake Tahoe famous, its impossible blue clarity, is being slowly compromised by the cumulative weight of human presence around its shores. The September 2025 dive made all of this visible in a way that no previous expedition had managed. It was the first time the journey to the bottom had ever been broadcast live to a public audience, and what that audience watched was not a legend confirmed. It was a legend dissolved cleanly by cameras that simply went and looked without flinching. Tahoe is not bottomless. It has a floor, mapped in more detail now than most people's own neighborhoods, sitting at 1,645 feet in its deepest section, every inch of it measurable and real. And that floor does not hold a cathedral of the standing dead. It holds the things that were thrown from boats, dropped from docks, swept off shorelines, and abandoned in the water over more than a century of millions of annual visitors treating the most beautiful lake on the continent, as if what sinks out of sight becomes someone else's problem. There is something important in the numbers that came out of the September 2025 dive that goes beyond the legends. Tim Crandall, president of Seaview Systems, the company that helped engineer the Deep Emerald's tether system, explained during the live stream that traditional ROVs use copper cable, which limits both depth capability and video resolution. The fiber optic tether used by Deep Emerald was what made both the depth and the live 4K broadcast possible simultaneously. That technical detail matters because it represents the first time a machine capable of reaching the very bottom of Lake Tahoe could also transmit a clear, live picture of what it was seeing in real time to any screen in the world. Previous ROV work at the lake had produced footage, but none of it had ever been watched live by thousands of people who had grown up with the legends. The act of watching it happen, in real time, not as a documentary produced months later, but as a live event, changed the experience of the information entirely. There was no room for the footage to be edited or selective. The lake floor appeared exactly as it was, at the exact moment the ROV reached it, and the people watching had to process what they saw without any interpretive buffer between themselves and the camera. What the scientific community watching the live descent also noted was the behavior of the water itself at that depth. Dr. Chandra described the particles floating through the camera beam as flocculent material, fine sediments from the watershed, dead algae, organic and inorganic matter that had settled toward the floor but remained partially suspended. He pointed out that the bottom of the lake is not perfectly motionless in the way the legends imagined a sealed vault to be. Subtle currents exist even at that depth, gentle enough to slowly resettle sediment over time, the way a very light breath moves dust across a floor. The frozen tableau of perfectly preserved figures standing at rigid attention that the stories described was never physically possible in a place with even the faintest current at work across centuries of time. The Washoe people, who have lived around Lake Tahoe for thousands of years and have treated it as a sacred place for longer than any of the casino legends or the campfire ghost stories, had a relationship with this water built on care rather than fear. Their reverence for the lake, read now against what the cameras found on its floor, looks less like superstition and more like the clearest possible instruction anyone ever gave about this place, that it deserves to be treated with the same respect people claim to feel when they stand at its edge and call it beautiful. The name Tahoe itself comes from the Washoe language, meaning big water or water in a high place. The people who named it did not name it for its monsters. They named it for what it is. There's a particular weight to the gap between what people say about Lake Tahoe and what the cameras found on its floor. People travel hundreds of miles to stand at its edge. They describe the color of the water as unlike anything else in the world. They bring their children to it generation after generation. They call it pristine. And simultaneously, the floor of this lake is scattered with the 80 confirmed recovered tires that Lindsay Kopf and her team had already pulled from the water using the Deep Emerald ROV in earlier expeditions, with bottles, cans, and tangled fishing gear fused by decades of cold into unreadable masses. With a perfectly preserved happy birthday balloon sitting at the very deepest point, 1,600 feet down, still silver and still readable in the permanent dark. The cold that the legends promised would hold bodies forever has instead been holding garbage forever. The refrigerator effect, that genuinely remarkable physical reality that made the ghost stories feel so plausible, has been applied not to the dramatic things that imagination placed down there, but to the completely ordinary things that people actually put there themselves across more than a century of visits. The lake kept everything. It was never a vault of the dead. It was always a vault of what the living left behind, and the only thing that prevented people from knowing that for so long was the absence of a machine that could go all the way to the bottom and simply look. The legends can rest now. The bottom exists, and it is mapped. The graveyard is not there. The drowned forests are real, ancient, and still standing after 5,000 years in the cold dark, which is stranger and more genuinely remarkable than any ghost story. The Cousteau quote was almost certainly never spoken by the man it is pinned to, and the world did not need protection from what is down there. It needed to look at what is down there and take responsibility for it. The cameras went down into the dark, expecting to either confirm a legend or find nothing. What they found instead was the truth that had been waiting quietly under all of that cold water all along. A mirror that the lake had been holding perfectly still, showing exactly what the living had been leaving behind. And that mirror, when it finally appeared on a screen for the whole world to watch, proved to be far more powerful than any ghost story had ever been.